Indonesia, EAEU may sign free trade agreement within 2 years, Russian envoy says. Negotiations on the creation of a free trade area between Indonesia and the Eurasian Economic Union, EAEU, have already been launched, with a corresponding agreement expected to be signed within 2 years, Russian ambassador to Jakarta Ludmila Vorobieva told. The process of negotiations on the free trade area and the corresponding agreement between the EAEU and the Indonesian government was launched at the end of last year, Vorobieva said, adding that according to preliminary estimates, the process could take up to 2 years. Indonesians are very enthusiastic about the prospects for such cooperation, the diplomat added. They have a lot of experience. Indonesia has many such agreements, and they strongly count on the imminent signing of this agreement, the Russian ambassador said. In early December 2022, Eurasian Economic Commission, EEC, Trade Minister Andrei Sleneta said that the EAEU attached great importance to the development of mutually beneficial cooperation with Indonesia, one of the main trading partners in ASEAN and the Asia-Pacific region as a whole. The EAEU, which is made up of 5 former Soviet countries Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia, is designed to ensure the free movement of goods, services and labor between member states implemented via common economic policies and regulation in the areas of industry, agriculture, energy, foreign trade, and investment. Lavrov, U.S. officials admit that they are responsible for Nord Stream explosions. Earlier this week, Pulitzer Prize winner Seymour Hersh wrote an investigative piece describing in detail how U.S. deep-water divers had planted explosives under 3 Nord Stream pipelines during the NATO Baltops drills last summer. The explosives were detonated remotely on September 26, 2022, at the order of President Joe Biden, Hersh wrote. Officials in the United States admit that they were behind the explosions at the Nord Stream pipeline, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Sunday. Now they even enjoy talking about it, the foreign minister said, adding that the U.S. sabotaged the Russian pipeline in order to destroy a powerful alliance based on Russian energy resources and German technology that began to threaten the monopoly of many American corporations. Lavrov's comments come on the heels of a bombshell revelation by Pulitzer Prize-winning American journalist Seymour Hersh, who wrote an investigative piece earlier this week into the gas pipeline explosions. Based on information from sources, the journalist wrote that during the NATO Baltops exercise in the summer of 2022, U.S. Navy divers planted explosives under the Nord Stream pipelines, which were detonated 3 months later at the order of U.S. President Joe Biden. According to Hersh, Biden decided to sabotage Nord Stream after more than 9 months of secret discussions with the national security team. Hersh also cited a source with direct knowledge of the U.S. operational planning as saying that Norway played a key role in helping the United States organize the attack and keep the Swedish and Danish navies in the dark. The Pentagon has denied responsibility for the blasts. Flight Radar 24 data showing that U.S. and German Navy aircraft regularly circled over the sites of future explosions on the Nord Stream pipelines during the NATO Baltops 22 exercise last summer. Between June 8 and June 16, 2022, German and U.S. maritime surveillance aircraft P-3 Orion and P-8 Poseidon carried out regular flights over the sites of future Nord Stream blasts. The military aircraft descended to low altitudes and turned off transponders in almost every flight, so some of their trajectories remained unrecorded. On June 8, the American Poseidon aircraft circled over the sites of 3 future explosions on the Nord Stream pipelines northeast of Bornholm Island. The German P-3 Orion aircraft then flew over a future blast site east of the island. On June 9, the Poseidon aircraft flew over the sites northeast and east of Bornholm. From June 11 to June 15, the U.S. Poseidon aircraft circled precisely over the sites of future Nord Stream sabotage acts every day, often making many turns and loops at low altitude. On June 16, the German P-3 Orion flew over the area. The minimum flight altitude of U.S. and German military aircraft over the Baltic Sea around the location of the gas pipelines was less than 600 meters, 0.4 miles. However, it could have been even lower in those parts of the flights that were not recorded by the open monitoring system. Late last month, U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland hailed the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, saying that the U.S. administration is very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova pointed out that Nuland's words were proof of the Biden administration's approval of the terrorist attack that destroyed civilian infrastructure, as well as evidence of Washington's motive for undermining global energy security. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, for his part, described the pipeline explosions as a tremendous opportunity, which would enable EU nations to become less dependent on Russian energy. The blasts occurred on September 26, 2022 at 3 of the 4 strings of Nord Stream 1 and 2 underwater pipelines built to carry a combined 110 billion cubic meters of Russian gas to Europe annually. The incidents halted gas deliveries to Germany ahead of the cold season, prompting a gas price hike and a scramble for alternative sources in the European Union. Germany, Denmark, and Sweden launched separate investigations into the sabotage, with German media reporting trust issues among the 3 EU nations. The Russian Chief Prosecutor's Office said it had opened an inquiry into possible international terrorism. Airspace restrictions over Montana lifted after unidentified object scare. Washington, no suspicious objects were detected over the U.S. state of Montana, and the airspace restrictions introduced earlier have been lifted, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, says. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, closed the airspace around the city of Havre in Montana, near the border with Canada, on Saturday, saying that the closure was implemented to support U.S. Department of Defense activities. U.S. Senator from Montana John Tester said on Twitter on Saturday that he was aware of the object in Montana airspace. With the cooperation of the Federal Aviation Administration, North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, implemented a temporary flight restriction airspace in central Montana on February 11, 2023, to ensure the safety of air traffic in the area during NORAD operations. The restriction has been lifted, NORAD said later on Saturday. According to the statement, no suspicious objects were detected. NORAD detected a radar anomaly and sent fighter aircraft to investigate. Those aircraft did not identify any object to correlate to the radar hits, NORAD said. Earlier on Saturday, NORAD said in a statement to Sputnik that it was tracking a high-altitude airborne object over northern Canada. Later in the day, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that the unidentified object was shot down by a US F-22 aircraft over the Yukon. The White House said that the downed object had been tracked over 24 hours and was unmanned. U.S. trade deficit reaches nearly $1 trillion. What does this say about the American economy? The U.S. trade deficit soared to almost $1 trillion in 2022, according to data released Tuesday by the Commerce Department. The gap between what the nation imports and what it exports rose by $103 billion from the previous year. Former U.S. President Donald Trump used to refer to the trade deficit as a troubling factor and even resort to protective measures and tariff hikes in order to narrow the gap. Still, macro trends show that the U.S. trade deficit has steadily grown over the past several years until it jumped to a whopping $948.1 billion, its largest total on record under the Biden administration. U.S. economists have traditionally warned that a growing trade deficit could result in further loss of manufacturing jobs, depressed wages, and slower economic growth. According to the U.S. press, rapid inflation and higher energy prices could be responsible for some of the recent spike, since the trade data is not adjusted for inflation. On the other hand, the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes strengthened the U.S. dollar, which eventually made foreign goods cheaper than American ones, fanning the trade deficit up. Even though the Western media reported that some European industries are looking to settle in the U.S. over fears of looming recession and energy crunch in the EU, many of the US-owned production facilities remain overseas. Recent Commerce Department data indicated that the Americans have a long way to go to reshore production back to the U.S. Last year saw the U.S. trade deficit in goods grow strongly with Mexico, Canada, India, South Korea, Vietnam, and Taiwan. According to the U.S. press, this was largely caused by Washington's attempt to diversify its trade with China. In particular, the U.S. trade deficit with Mexico grew 20.7%, reaching $130 billion. However, despite tensions simmering between Washington and Beijing over a wide range of issues, including Taiwan, the South China Sea, the Hawaii Telecom Company, and sweeping semiconductor restrictions, US-China trade remains strong. Apparently one could hardly imagine that the U.S. trade deficit with China would rise by 8.3% to $382.9 billion in 2022, the second highest total on record. The media suggested that this happened due to U.S. companies' unwillingness or inability to sharply cut ties with China. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden avoided focusing on the trend during his latest State of the Union speech, in which he proclaimed that the U.S. had overcome the 2022 economic and supply chain crises and emerged triumphant. Still, as American conservative observers say, the U.S. president's optimism is not grounded in reality. Former acting U.S. Defense Secretary, cut military spending by half, stop hyping China threat. As the Biden administration prepares to request congressional approval of the largest military budget in U.S. history, Trump's final pick for Pentagon chief has urged a 40-50% reduction in spending on the armed forces, saying the Defense Department is too big and bloated and wasteful. Former acting Secretary of Defense Chris Miller has raised eyebrows by calling out the military-industrial complex by name, as well as urging policymakers to dramatically cut the Pentagon's budget and to stop demonizing China. We have created an entire enterprise that focuses economically on creating crises to justify outrageously high defense spending, Miller lamented in an interview with CBS. With the military-industrial complex having become a hydra-headed monster and with virtually no brakes on the American war machine, Miller told CBS that you have to starve the beast to make people come out of their cubbyholes and start thinking creatively. The former acting defense secretary has also condemned the frequent saber-rattling that's come to dominate popular American political discourse regarding the alleged military threat which U.S. leaders claim emanates from China. Miller argued that by constantly harping on the fact that the Chinese are the greatest threat to America and whatnot, Washington's political class is giving China's leadership the opportunity to have an enemy that they can focus their people's anger and attention on. In his new memoir, Soldier Secretary, Miller calls to cut Defense Department spending by 40% to 50% so that it would be closer to pre-9/11 spending levels, given that the U.S. is no longer waging wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Much of his frustration with the course of the U.S. military appeared to stem from the double standards he says have been exposed in the wake of disastrous and bloody U.S. invasions in the Middle East. The more I thought, the more I was horrified, Miller writes. We invaded a sovereign nation, killed and maimed a lot of Iraqis, and lost some of the greatest American patriots to ever live all for a goddamn lie. What really bothers me, Miller said in an interview with The Hill this week, is how our young soldiers see the hypocrisy in the system. If they end up being late for work, they get in a lot of trouble, he noted, adding that if a soldier were to mess up a piece of paperwork for a supply request, there's a possibility they can be kicked out of the service. And on the other side of the equation, there's the people who lose wars and end up advancing on to other positions of power and wealth, Miller stated. And that's what really bugs me. It's a theme the former acting Secretary of Defense returns to frequently in his new book. The recognition that so many sacrifices were ultimately made in the service of a lie, as in Iraq, or to further a delusion, as in the neoconservatives' utopian fantasy of a democratic Middle East. It still makes my blood boil, and it probably will until the day I die, he writes. But despite the raw emotions on display in the memoir, Miller doesn't express much optimism that lawmakers in Washington will heed his call for a more reasonable Pentagon budget. There's no incentive to reduce military spending, he told The Hill. I think there's whispers, but we need someone with the courage and experience to get in there and force it.